Math 100, Lesson 7-2, multiply and divide rational expressions. So in section 1, we simplified our rational expressions, and now we're going to take two rational expressions and multiply them together or divide them by each other. All right, so let's start with a problem that is multiplying. So we've got two rational expressions here. We've got 9 over x plus 4 times x minus 5 over 2. So two fractions, we're multiplying them together. Well, if we could, we would factor the numerator and denominator just like we did in section 1. So if we could, that's where we would start. And just like in section 1, we would divide by any common factors, if we could do that, before we actually start multiplying. After we do those things, we would multiply what's left. Well, in this case, you can't factor the numerator and denominator of either one of our expressions. So step number 1 and step number 2 are kind of taken care of. Can't factor. There are no common factors to divide. So we just multiply what's left. So we're going to multiply 9 times x minus 5 and 2 times x plus 4. I like to put the number in front of the parentheses. So we will go ahead and distribute that, and we'll get 9x minus 45 divided by 2x plus 8. And so that would be our solution here. So that one was really straightforward because there were no common factors to divide out. Okay, so we're still multiplying on this one. Remember, our step number 1 says before we worry about multiplying, we factor all the numerators and denominators if possible. Well, the first fraction, you cannot simplify or factor the numerator or the denominator. So I'm going to leave this first fraction alone, my first expression. My second expression, I can factor out a 3 out of the numerator, and I can factor out an 8 in my denominator. Now, after I factor, it says that we are supposed to divide out any common factors. Well, I have an x plus 4 in the numerator and an x plus 4 in the denominator. That divides to give me 1. I have an x minus 7 in the denominator and an x minus 7 in the numerator. That gives me 1. So then the last thing it says to do is multiply what's left. Well, the only thing I got left is a 1 times 3 times 3 in the numerator. In my denominator, I have a 1 times 8 times 1. So I end up with 3/8. All right, let's try this one. So we start again by factoring any of the parts that can be factored. This first expression cannot be factored, so I'm going to bring it down. My second expression, that's difference of squares in the numerator. And in the denominator, I can factor out a 9. Okay, once we get everything factored, we divide by any common factors. Okay, x minus 5 and x minus 5. As long as one's in the numerator, one's in the denominator, they divide to give me 1. X minus 2 and x minus 2, that divides to give me 1. And so the last thing to do is multiply what's left. So in my numerator, I have 1 times x plus 2 times 1, which is just x plus 2. In my denominator, I have 1 times 9 times 1, which is 9. So that would be my solution. Okay, they get slightly bigger. So far, only one of my fractions has been able to factor. right, so I believe in this problem you are going to understand the importance of Chapter 6, all the factoring that we've been doing. All right, so the first thing we need to do here is factor any numerator and denominator that can be factored. In this case, everything can be factored. So my numerator in the first expression, I can factor out a 5. My denominator in the first expression, I can factor out a 7x. Whoops. All right. My second fraction, my numerator doesn't have a greatest common factor, but it's a trinomial. So I'm going to do that work up here beside it. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be a times c, which is -6, and add to be b. Okay, so those have to be +3 and -2 in order to work. I like faux fractions. I take my a value with the variable, put it over one factor I found, my a value with the variable, and put it over the other one I found. If the fraction can simplify, I do. In this case, it does. And then I read it top to bottom. So my factors for my numerator are 2x plus 3 times x minus 1. Now you are welcome to do the factor by grouping. Just like I did, do it off to the side and then put your factors where they belong in the expression. Now our denominator here is difference of squares. All right. Now, before I do any of my, I've got common factors, I want to pay attention to these two are very close to the same, but notice that they are backwards. The one on the bottom says 1 minus x, not x minus 1. So this is where I have to factor out that -1. I'm going to go ahead and do that because that's still factoring. So my numerator won't change. Factoring out a negative in my denominator puts that negative out front with the 7x, and now I'm able to turn this around to say x minus 1. Okay, and this expression on the right I did not change. My factoring over here is complete. All right, so now I divide out any common factors. All right, I have an x minus 1 in the numerator and the denominator. That divides to give me 1. I have a 2x plus 3 and a 2x plus 3. That divides to give me 1. And then I multiply what's left. So in my numerator, I have 5 times x plus 1 times 1 times 1 gives me 5 times x plus 1. My denominator, I have -7x times 1 times 1 times 2x minus 3. Now, I do need you to pay attention to my MATLAB and see if it wants you to distribute that. It may tell you to distribute, it may not. This is a satisfactory answer, and I think my MATLAB will take it most of the time. Occasionally it does want you to distribute through the parentheses. It just won't do us any good to do that. I'm going to stop right there. Okay, so we have done 4 multiplication problems. So now let's go and do some division. All right. So I've got x plus 3 divided by this fraction. Now, I'm going to come over here to the side and just do a quick little review. Over here. Let's just review some basic fractions. If I have 2/3 and I want to divide it by 2/5, well, you don't really divide fractions. What we do is we say leave the first fraction alone, change the division to multiply, and let's use the reciprocal of the second fraction. Notice we flipped it over. That's what a reciprocal means. Now we're ready to multiply. In this particular problem, we've got a common factor that will divide out. And so I'm left with 1 times 5 in the numerator and 3 times 1 in the denominator. So what I wanted you to remember here was that in order to divide fractions, we really change it to multiply, and then we multiply by the reciprocal. Okay, so let's apply that to this problem. So our x plus 3 is not going to change. We're going to change divide to multiply, and we're going to multiply by the reciprocal, which just means we turn the fraction over. Now, I'm going to stick a 1 up under this because I do like to see a fraction times a fraction. Now, our next step would be factor the numerators and denominators. Well, they're all factored. The next step would be divide out any common factors. There are no common factors. So then the last thing to do, it says, is multiply what's left. So I've got x plus 3 times x plus 7. It is super important that those are both in parentheses. Otherwise, it says something entirely different. In the denominator, I have 1 times x minus 4. And we can leave our answer just like that. Okay, let's try another division problem. All right, so I have 2 fractions and it says divide. So my first step here is going to be, let's change that to multiply. All right, because we cannot divide fractions. We actually multiply by the reciprocal, which would be flip that fraction over. Okay, so all I've done right now is I changed my divide to multiply, and I flipped over the second fraction. I used its reciprocal. I'm not sure why my things are disappearing as I write them. Okay, so now we have multiply. And so now we go back to our little multiplying rules that say factor any numerator or denominator that can be factored. Well, this factor over here, this numerator on the left-hand side can be factored. It is a trinomial. A times C is 6. And my B value is 5. So the numbers I will use are 2 and 3. I prefer faux fractions. So my A value with the variable over one of them. My A value with the variable over the other one. So my factors in the numerator are x plus 2 times x plus 3. The denominator is difference of squares. So x plus 5 times x minus 5. And now this second fraction, you cannot factor it. So we just bring it down. All right, and so the next thing we do is divide out any common factors. So I do have some common factors. I have an x plus 2 in the numerator, an x plus 2 in the denominator. That divides to give me 1. X plus 5 in the numerator, x plus 5 in the denominator, divides to give me 1. There are no more common factors, so I multiply what's left. So 1 times x plus 3 times 1 is x plus 3. In the denominator, 1 times x minus 5 times 1 is x minus 5. And we are done. Those are not common factors. They cannot divide out. All right. Let's try another. All right. So when my problem says to divide, my first step is rewrite it as a multiplication. Okay, so the first fraction does not change. I just bring it down. Change my divide to multiply, and I multiply by the reciprocal. Well, currently, my denominator is that 1 that I did not see. So when I write the reciprocal, it's 1 over 7y squared plus 21y. All right, so now that it's multiplying, I do my multiplication rules, which says the next step is to factor the numerator and denominator, if it can be. So this first numerator is a trinomial. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be 1 times 12 is 12. And two numbers that add to be 7. Okay, that does exist. That's 4 and 3. I prefer faux fractions, so my a value with the variable over one of the numbers I found. My a value with the variable over the other number I found. If they can simplify, you do, and these cannot. So my factors for the numerator are y plus 4 times y plus 3. My denominator is y squared plus 9. There is no rule that allows me to factor that. Okay, there is no rule for sum of squares. Only there is a rule for difference of squares, and this is not a difference. So that denominator cannot be simplified, cannot be factored. All right, the denominator on the right-hand side, I can factor out a 7y, and I'd be left with y plus 3. My next step, divide out any common factors. I have a y plus 3 in the numerator, y plus 3 in the denominator, and there are no other common factors. So my solution here is y plus 4 times 1, and then 7y times y squared plus 9. Now, I don't mind if you put 7y after the y squared plus 9, but y squared plus 9 must be in parentheses. Otherwise, it says something entirely different. So this would be our solution. So be careful when you are working with these fractions. Make sure that if it's divide, you change it to a multiply. And we've got lots of factoring all through the middle of these problems. If you have any questions, please let me know.